Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And we've got another Raistlin episode for you guys. I know how much everybody loves their Raistlin. So here we go. We're examining another relationship of his. Joy. Well, actually, it's not Nurse Joy that we're going to be talking about him bonding with. Though that would be humorous. Actually, we're going to be discussing, as the title says, the relationship between Flint and Raistlin. This is a bit more of a complicated relationship. And by complicated, I mean mutual hatred. Flint helped raise Raistlin to an extent. If by raised you mean avoided, hated, and badmouthed, and tolerated, if only because he liked Raistlin's brother better and Sturm, and they wouldn't really hang out with Flint without Raistlin around. So yeah, that's a pretty twisted relationship. On the other hand, when Flint lies dying in Dragons of the Hourglass Mage, Raistlin actually ends up seemingly a little brokenhearted over it, and he genuinely feels a certain amount of loss over Flint's death. This is nothing compared to the flow of tears Raistlin doles out for Sturm's death, crying brokenly over that death, which is a surprise. Flint delivers that news in a particularly cruel manner in Dragons of Hourglass Mage, throwing it in Raistlin's face and saying, "Good riddance to you, I wish it was you." Essentially, that's basically the message, which is typical of Flint. I know fans really like Flint, but he is a character whom can be easy to love, but also easy to just roll your eyes at and feel irritation towards. Now, the reason I say that is because his hatred of Raistlin is very irrational. Utterly despises the guy with such fervor, when weirdly Raistlin ironically didn't really do anything as a kid to deserve it. Yeah, he wasn't exactly a lovable kid, but you're the self-proclaimed dad of the team, and yet, you went out of your way to basically make sure the kid knew how much you hated him. But on the other hand, Flint comes from a superstitious people called the Hill Dwarves, are very superstitious and believe that everything that's happened that's wrong in their lives is the fault of the mountain dwarves. That said, hill dwarves are very good workers. They typically work blue-collar jobs, primarily of metalsmithing, stone shaping, and even carpentry, and they're very good at it. But what they've kind of failed to develop was a more advanced civilization. They've not built any cities in the past few centuries, and they've not really managed to leave their mark on Krynn like the mountain dwarves have. Because the mountain dwarves have all the farming, have also the blue-collar jobs, but also the kingdom that's still standing and fairly strong after the cataclysm. I'm not trying to completely bash the hill dwarves. They have a lot that I do like about them. The thing is, they're lovable. You just can't help but like them. And Flint has that charm, but the trouble with Flint is the superstitions of his people and the hatred for everything magical is fairly irrational. Now, the reason that they have this hatred is because of Vista and Dantalus, blowing up a large chunk of their population back in the Dwarf Gate Wars. The problem is that Flint's basically transferred it to a 16-year-old kid who, frankly, is kind of an innocent. Kind of. Not exactly, but he just wants to be a great mage because he's got nothing else to live for, especially since his health couldn't last without magic.
Flint may have been good with all the other members of the Heroes of the Lance, but with Raistlin,
yeah, he was not very good.
He was the scapegoat.
Raistlin received all the hatred. Flint is very prejudiced against Boopoo, the gully dwarf, even though she's a very pitiable character. And Raistlin evidently came to greatly care for her and pity her when he sends her away because she's crying in the night because she misses her people and she can't deal with the homesickness. She loves Raistlin, but she can't deal with the homesickness. Raistlin just says, "Go back home." Sends her off. Flint reacts with a certain amount of scorn, which earns him a death glare from Raistlin that Flint never forgets, and that sends him shivering and scampering back to sleep, while Raistlin just prays that Boopoo has a good life. The trouble is that Raistlin is someone whom, how do I put it? There's an old saying, we hate that which we have abused in the past already. I think it's Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky once said, we hate those, not that have wronged us, but that we have wronged and harmed and have abused. I didn't used to believe that saying. When I had to read that particular book, which was the brothers Karamazov in university, I found it a heart-wrenching statement, and I thought, no, that can't be true. Now, my professor, he was a very cynical man, but he said, yes, it is true. Just look at history. You're a historian. Nowadays, I'm just kind of thinking there's a certain amount of truth, sadly. And that's the thing. I think with Flint, he hates Raistlin because he has harmed Raistlin. Raistlin represents Flint's sins. he is a constant reminder that Flint doesn't always measure up. And I know people might say, well, there's a touch of Raistlin in everyone, and that's what they hate to see. Yes, but it's also that he has not been a perfect dad. And seeing Raistlin kind of tells him that, just by looking at Raistlin, that he screwed up, and he hates Raistlin for that. In turn, Raistlin hates Flint for being slower than him. The two generally just don't like each other. But when Flint finds out that Raistlin is dying in Dragons of Hourglass Mage, he doesn't shed a tear, he just says, good riddance. But when Raistlin finds out Flint is dying, Raistlin sheds many a tears. This dynamic between the two characters is very one-sided. It's a very twisted bond.
Raistlin has no reason to shed tears for Flint, and yet
I think the idea is that we're supposed to read that Raistlin does have a certain amount of good in him. He's always been a red robe at his core, as many of our fans have noted. And that Raistlin is always in the middle. He's always neutral. He obviously has a dark side, as we see later in Dragonlance, but there's a sliver of good in him, always. Far more so than, say, Darth Vader from Star Wars. We're not just going to spend all this time bashing Flint. Flint is someone whom, in some ways, on the other hand, seeing Raistlin as a gold-skinned, demonic-looking mage, it must have been a bit terrifying to see him like that. Because last you saw him, he was essentially a 20 to 21-year-old punk with delusions of grandeur. Next time you see him, he's a gold-skinned cripple. That's going to be a little jarring for anyone. It must be humiliating and annoying being told you're dumb by someone probably like a tenth of your age. So there is that. Raistlin does deserve a bit of the blame for why this relationship is so bitter. He's generally someone who's fairly biting and sarcastic and snobbish.
part of me does wonder, how would things have turned out if Flint treated Raistlin well? Whenever another party member would talk down to him, he's like, hey, have some respect.
I don't know. That's my honest response. I don't think Flint was able to do that for Raistlin. The thing is, he would have been slightly less biting, but he was biting with everyone, even Tanis and Caramon, whom he really liked. The only one he was soft with, to an extent, was Sturm, but he pitied Sturm a lot. The trouble is, the pity, I don't know if Raistlin would have accepted, but the slightly less biting wit, or I should say, the non-cruel comments, and I hope you die soon kind of remarks, probably Raistlin would have probably liked him a bit more, and maybe been willing to counsel him and cooperate with him a bit more like he does with Tanis. Raistlin, on the other hand, does reference that he appreciates what Flint did do for him and his brother. He did kind of help them out when they were financially broke after Mom and Dad died and Kitsiara ditched. He did take them on some of his adventures and did help them out a little. He did. And he taught them some skills they would later use in life. So he was abusive in a way, but on a practical level, he wasn't.
The only one of the measures that he truly did like may have been Caramon.
He initially took a little to Kitsiara because she could be charming, but then afterwards he was very wary of her. And he kind of shared the same opinion as Raistlin about Kitsiara. Best be careful with that woman. She's not a good lady. And in this regard, it's interesting that Flint, in some ways, and Raistlin share the same incisive, perceptive wisdom as one another. I think that Raistlin kind of got a bit of his perceptiveness from Flint. And because Flint did have a perceptive side.
When Flint's right, he's right.
But when he's wrong, boy oh howdy is he wrong.
I mean, everything is dwarven made.
Yes, I love that about Flint. We should make a Flint appreciation episode soon. Do feel free to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Reorx, father of all dwarves, smashing a bit of metal into shape.